Once we've aligned all our shots, we can start to look at depth grading. Like color grading is to color, depth grading is the act of managing the volume of the depth of our shots for the best creative and technical outcome. We can loosely divide depth grading into three different zones. There's setting a convergence point, there's managing the depth, and there's handling depth transitions. So let's look at all of those. Setting a convergence point in Mistika is very simple. Just with match move X enabled and auto match, we can just click anywhere in the scene and a convergence point is set. So just as a reminder, the point of convergence is where an image from the left eye and the right eye perfectly overlay. So there's no horizontal difference between them, like on the eye here. And the effect on the viewer of the point of convergence is that whatever is at the point of convergence will feel like it's on the plane of the screen they're watching, their TV or cinema screen. Meanwhile, anything further away, like the wall in this instance, will feel like it's pushed back into the screen, in the positive parallax area. Meanwhile, anything in front of the point of convergence will feel like it's coming out into the audience space, the negative parallax area. So what technically is happening when we set a point of convergence? Well, actually pressing match move X just feeds a value into balanced geometry position X. If I drag it up and down, we can see what's happening. It's contra sliding both sides to choose at what point in the image that perfect overlay happens, that point of convergence is created. Because I've got apply on both left and right, it's contra sliding both sides. If I had it on left only, then only the left channel would move to match the right. Now obviously, because we're sliding the image, if we just look at the left eye only, and I'm going to fill my edges with black, we could see that we're obviously sliding the image off and creating a black edge. Now needless to say, we'd never really push it that far, but you get the point that as we slide over, we have an edge issue to deal with. So for that reason, it's not at all uncommon to go into adjust geometry and add in a couple of % of zoom just to clean up those edges. Alternatively, we could use the edge extrude function here. So rather than fill the edges with black, we can extrude out the last pixel. In terms of where to set the point of convergence, well, to say that in a tutorial would be like doing a tutorial on color grading and saying what color the shot should be. As with color grading, setting a point of convergence is an artistic decision based on what you want to achieve out of the shot, but respecting technical limitations. So let's look at a few different possibilities. It's true to say that the point of convergence is actually the easiest point on the screen for the audience to view. This is because the eyes of the audience are both focusing on the screen and converging on the screen at that point. So we might start off by saying that the point of convergence could be the area of interest in the scene, perhaps the person speaking, or maybe the person whose reaction is important. But that decision might be affected by other technical aspects. For example, as you can see, if I place a convergence point here, the background is becoming more and more diverse. And obviously in an extreme case, we might end up with a wide disparity, a wide double image that would cause the audience a great deal of fatigue to keep watching. We'll look at some more depth management functions later, but when setting a point of convergence, we might find that we have a limitation which is set by how the shot was arranged originally. Likewise, if I set the convergence at the back of the shot, then this girl is trying to come out of the screen quite strongly, and that would cause me an issue called an edge violation, which we'll look at the fixes for later. But what an edge violation is it's where an object is trying to come out of the screen, but is also being cropped by the edge of the screen. If you imagine in reality, if this girl was in front of the screen, she would of course overflow outside the screen area, so she wouldn't be cropped by the screen itself. She could only be cropped by the screen if she's behind the screen. So we're creating an impossibility in real life, which is stereoscopically she's in front of the screen, but she's also being cropped by the screen, which means that she must be behind it as well. Obviously that can't happen in real life, so the audience's brain never has to deal with that. but certainly if the audience were directed to stare at this area, quite a few would start getting headaches. And so when we come to set our point of convergence, we might choose a point that accommodates the edges to ensure that the most foreground objects that intersect the screen edge are behind it. So perhaps a logical convergence point for this shot might be on the boy's eyes, because he's the point of interest. That'll leave his finger nicely sticking out of the screen and everything else comfortably sitting back into the shot. Of course, there's no reason why we can't animate convergence points, and it might well be that at the beginning of the shot I might want to converge on his eyes, but then I might want to go to Mum's reaction. So by having auto key on, I've created an animating convergence point. So if we zoom up here to see the double image on her, we can see that we gradually go to her. Animating the point of convergence is also something that we can do across an edit in order to smooth out a jarring cut. So I'm just going to delete out that animation and set a point of convergence on her for the time being. Now my next shot, I've actually got a shot where I really do want these characters to come out into the audience space. So you can see I've set them to be quite negative in their parallax. But that means that we're going from a shot where our point of convergence is some way into the scene, and then jumping to a shot where the area of interest, the area where our eye would naturally go to in the cut, is in a different Z position, a different depth from us. Now in some circumstances that can cause a jar across the cut. It almost feels like it's a bad edit, but when you play it in 2D it feels fine, and when you play it in 3D the cut somehow jars. And if you feel that, it's because of this jump in convergence point. And so we can fix that with a stereo handoff or a stereo transition. So just jumping back to the timeline a second, I'm just going to lasso those two shots, and under FX I'm going to choose stereo handoff. So it's added an effect that runs over a little bit of the end of the previous shot and the beginning of the next shot. And what it'll do is it'll animate convergence for us to more gradually allow the audience's eye to adjust between those two shots. So the way we make it work is like this. I'll go to my outgoing shot. I'm just going to double click the stereo effect. And I'm going to pick the tail disparity. So in this case, I'm picking where the audience is looking, and I think at the end of this shot the audience is going to be looking at Mum because she's reacting. So by picking a tail, you can see that a number has appeared for the tail of the clip, the outgoing clip. So now I'm just going to do the same for the incoming clip. Again, double clicking stereo effect, only this time I'm going to pick head, and I'm going to pick the area of interest that I think the audience's eye will be directed to, which is here. So now you can see the difference in disparity between those two shots. So now the only thing to do is to double click the stereo handoff effect and just set the stereo depth transition. And what that's actually done is it's created an animation in the convergence point that drifts across the cut, and we can see it in action. As you can see, towards the end of the outgoing shot, our point of convergence is as we set it, but as we approach the cut, you can see that the convergence is drifting. And in this case, it's actually bringing her closer to the point of convergence of this shot, so that at the point of the edit, their convergence points match. And then as we continue into this shot, the convergence is allowed to end up where we wanted it to be set. So if we ever feel that there's a jar in a 3D edit, then it could be caused by a jump in convergence, and by using this method we can smooth out that jar. The duration of the stereo handoff is quite dependent on the shot content, but of course you can change it to be whatever you want it to be. Its default duration is picked up from here. We talked earlier about edge violations, and one possible fix for an edge violation is a thing called a floating window, which is a known method across post-producing stereoscopic material. So if I set my convergence point to this drain pipe in the back, we've created a problem here, an edge violation. And as we said, that edge violation is caused because we would expect this girl to come in front of the edge of this screen when of course she cannot physically do that. But one method we can use to make the edge violation a little less strenuous to look at is to actually match the cutoff points. So you can see that in my left image her crop point is here, but in the right image we can see a lot more of her. If we crop this right image so that we see the same cutoff point between the left and right images, this edge will be easier for the audience to look at. Now of course we could do that manually by working out where to put a crop, but as with many aspects of Mistika, there's an automated tool to help us. So all we need to do is to go pick floating window depth and pick the plane of the object that's causing us a problem. And you can see that Mistika will automatically calculate where that cutoff needs to be in order to make that foreground object have the same crop edge. Now, because Mistika doesn't know where we're looking on the screen, it will actually add a floating window onto both sides. So what we can do is just open the floating window folder, and the top parameter is for left, bottom for right, so I can just delete out the one that I don't want. There's also the ability to slant a floating window if you want to. Now some people swear by floating windows, and some people would say that they're a bit of a trick. Certainly this object would now be more comfortable to view because of the floating window. However, of course, there are limitations. We're looking at the full width of the frame. If we were looking at this on an overscan monitor, we wouldn't see the floating window. So we can't guarantee the floating window is actually going to be seen by our audience. Also, this floating window is fixing this foreground object, but actually, strictly speaking, it's causing retinal rivalry in the background because this area shouldn't be cropped off. But not many people go to the extent of rotoscoping a matte just for the foreground object. Personally, my view is that I will do everything possible to ensure that a floating window is not required. So I would set my depth in the shot to avoid this problem coming up in the first place, because I feel that floating windows aren't a reliable fix. But secondly, I might also consider that if we're talking about the fringe of the shot, where nothing interesting is happening, and the audience will always have their attention pulled over here, that I might also question why I'm compromising the depth of the whole shot just to fix a problem over here that really no one should be looking at. On the other hand, if this guy was talking and walked off the frame, and all the time we're watching him because he's talking, I'd make pretty sure that we didn't suffer an edge violation as he crossed the screen. So it's a case of balancing what's important in the shot. So I'm just going to clear that down. Another aspect when we're depth grading is we want to be sure that the amount of disparity that we're having in our shots is within a comfortable viewing amount. And usually the amount of disparity is actually set at the head of a project, perhaps by a broadcaster's technical specifications or by those of a given feature film. So it's important for us to be able to measure and manage the depth. So the first tool that we have to look at that is the depth graph here. So I'm just going to click and drag down just to change its sensitivity. So effectively what the depth graph is in its default setting, which is as a histogram, is it's just that, it's a histogram of depth. So imagine we're standing here, we're the audience, and we're looking this way. Forget the vertical bars for a second. This first spike would show the closest object to us, so perhaps it's him or the girl. And then there's a lull and another spike of action. Well, that would be the two adults. And then a lull and a spike at the back, and the back would probably be this feature here. So it gives us an indication of the components that are making up the depth in our scene. So the vertical bars, the green is the point of convergence, 0 meaning that there's a 0 amount of pixel difference at that point between the left and the right images. Then we have a bar to show a negative amount in terms of negative parallax, and a bar that shows a positive amount, as in the amount of pixels of disparity in a positive area. And we can control this and the sensitivity of the histogram using functions that are hidden away in the optical flow folder. So firstly we have the scale of the display itself. So this is saying that at this point here we would have minus 96 pixels of disparity for anything to get this far up the display, and positive of 32 pixels of disparity, which is a little wide, so let's just bring these down into something more reasonable. Then the bars themselves, you can see that one's gone off the edge because it was more than minus 30, are actually set in the next folder down. The negative split line and the positive split line. Now these lines actually have a couple of functions, but let's just use them initially as a guide. So let's say, for example, that I needed my stereoscopic image to fit within a broadcaster's specification, and their specification was no more than 1% of negative parallax and no more than 2% of positive parallax. Well, we're talking pixels here, and my image is 1920 pixels across. So 1% of 1920 is 19.2, but let's forget that 0.2 for the time being. And 2% of 1920 is 38. So what we've now got is quite a nice graphic representation that says that the allowable range of depth, according to the specifications of the broadcaster, is shown as everything between the blue and the red lines. And I can see at the moment that almost all of my scene is in positive parallax. In other words, it all pushes back. And this is a live display, so if I was to start changing the point of convergence, you can see that now I've actually brought most things out of the screen, but still within the limits that I'm allowed to use. On the other hand, if I push everything back here, we can see that we're getting to a point where the broadcaster is likely to reject this material because there's too much disparity in the distance. There's more than 2%. So I can use this depth graph to help me be sure that I'm creating images that are within specification. Incidentally, if I control and right click anywhere on the image, I'll get a little marker and it'll tell me how many pixels of disparity I have at any given point. So this is quite handy when you come to composite and you need to match the depth of something. The depth graph can also be displayed as a radar, a different way of showing the depth across the image. There's also a trace mode, where if I play a shot in the visual editor, then you can see the trace building. So that would allow me to see if there's any excessive depth appearing at any point in the shot. The depth graph takes some resources to run, so when you're not using it, switch it off. You remember that we had a brief look in optical flow when we found the Align XY mode in order to line up shots that had complex problems. The other modes here will align. We found that earlier. It's actually a shortcut from this button. So this just makes the left and right images overlay each other so that we can check that our colors are exactly right. There's also show depth, which will give us a rough depth mat that's created from comparing where the images are on the left and right screens. So sometimes we can use this for bump mapping or lighting effects, or even trying to key based on depth. And the one that I skipped, warp, is the one that we'll look at now. So warp allows us some interesting options to manage our depth. So we know that the disparity within the shot, i.e. the difference between left and right, is a function of a number of things. It's how far apart the original cameras were, known as the interaxial distance. It's also how far away the objects are from the camera, and it's also a function of the focal length of the cameras also. So all those things conspire together to create disparity. Mistika has some very strong tools to then control that disparity. Rather than just changing convergence point, we can actually change the volume of the depth. When we move a convergence point, all we're doing is we're effectively moving our 3D volume backwards and forwards so that the point of intersection between the screen and our 3D scene changes. But using the warp modes, we can actually change how much depth there is within our shot. So, to set this up, I'm going to initially choose warp, and then I'm going to put Y constrain on, same as this shortcut here. The reason being is that I'm going to start warping the image, but I only want to make an alteration in the X direction, because I've already lined this shot up. And the first thing we're going to look at is this all function here, which refers to the overall interaxial of the shot. It's on 1, which means 1 times what it was originally, in other words, no change. Now if I switch this down to 0, you can see that on the scene we now have no disparity between left and right. It's actually the same as pressing align warp. And this is what the image would have looked like if the cameras that shot this originally were actually sitting exactly on top of each other. So if I put it back up to 1, we can see we get our disparity back. If I put it up to 2, you can see we've got twice as much disparity. In other words, the volume of our shot has increased. We've got more depth. So the distance between our closest object and our furthest object has increased. So the effect of starting at 0 and slowly increasing this parameter is to gradually turn up the volume of our scene to make it deeper and deeper and deeper. So we might use this to manage our depth so that the depth in this scene is perhaps a better match to the scenes around it. Or we might use it to rein in a shot that's had too much depth because the cameras were shot too far apart, or even to add depth into a shot. This function means that Mistika is generating a lot of false material because, of course, as this is being pushed wider, Mistika is having to create pixels where a foreground object covers the background, because if the cameras were actually wider apart, then they would reveal a different part of the background. So for that reason, very high values in here, so this at the moment is 250% of the original amount, are quite likely to cause artifacts because there's so much of the scene that Mistika is basically having to invent. So that's using the overall interaxial to change the depth across the whole shot. But actually Mistika has a very nifty set of tools that allow us to divide the scene up into different zones and to change the depth in those zones differently. So I'm going to go back to my depth graph because this was another use of these bars. At the moment I've just used them as guidelines, but what I could actually do is use them to split up our image. So what I'm initially going to do is I'm just going to bring everything a little bit forward just for a demo, and I'm going to position the negative split to be in this valley in here, and I'm going to position the positive split to be at the back end of that content there. So before I was changing the interaxial of the whole shot, but actually I've got a negative interaxial, a middle and a positive. So the negative area will affect the depth within the items of the shot that are more negative than this split line. The middle will affect between the two split lines, and the positive split everything more positive than this line. So if I go back to anaglyph so we can see what we're looking at. So if I just change the positive interaxial, jumping between 2 and 1, so jumping between 1 and 200%, we can see that up here, if we keep an eye on this, the back wall is being pushed further away. But the relationship between mum and daughter isn't changing because the positive interaxial is only changing everything beyond this red line. Similarly, if I change the negative value, we can see we're having a greater effect on this foreground object, but not touching the rest of the scene. So we can use these tools to divide up our 3D scene into different zones to control the depth exactly as we would like it. If we push them too much, we will start to see artifacts, and as with all optical flow, the artifacts can be limited using these functions, but also by changing the range, and also, as we saw before, potentially by changing the gamma of the image that optical flow looks at to make its calculations. So using the array of tools from Mistika, between setting a convergence point and altering the effective interaxial distance of the shot, we can have quite fine levels of control over the depth in our scene in order to make our scenes more comfortable to view, but also to enable us to use depth as a character in its own right.